Welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me from his home in Arlington, Virginia is Shaka Ssali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Ndugu Paul.
How are you?
I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have suggested, an awesome son of Mother Africa.
Speaking about being an awesome son of Mother Africa, maybe let's start in our home country, Uganda, where things have been a bit chaotic. The last week, Bobi Wine was released on bail after being charged with COVID-19 violations. Let's start there. This is something that led to sporadic protests across the country. What did you read into this, Shaka?
Well, first of all, if in fact he violated the coronavirus pandemic regulations, he shouldn't have done that. Even though reports from the ground suggest that, in fact, when you talk about the measure of lockdown, that you are talking about selective lockdown, that in fact the lockdown does not affect everybody in the same way. That if you are either a card-carrying member of the ruling National Resistance Movement organization, or if you are operating for that particular ruling party, that you don't have to worry. I think that probably what we are seeing is people reacting to the objective social, economic, political contradictions.
What do you make of the uncoordinated troops that led to the death of nearly 50 people and over 100 people injured? There was so much chaos, people running downtown with guns, shooting at civilians.
It's uncalled for. And when you think about, honestly, a government that has been in place for about 35 years, you would say that is uncalled for. By now, it should really be very confident of itself. It shouldn't express or exhibit signs of insecurity. Because really, why do you have to shoot at people who happen to be unarmed, innocent, going about their affairs? Mind you, this is a government which came to power in 1986. Very, very popular. It had incredible goodwill. Apparently because the governments that occupied the political space before hadn't behaved quite well. So it would be very unfortunate, sincerely, if the current government ends up being more of the same. And when you think about it, I remember that in 2001, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, now of course reverting back to his name, Tibuhaburwa, promised that he needed people to elect him for the second and the final constitutional allowable term, so that he could, in fact, complete three very important things. One was to professionalize the army, which surely by now he must have professionalized. Two, to secure a regional economic market. We have since, of course, had the revival of the once popular and effective East African community. So the regional economic market is there. But what is remaining to be fulfilled is perhaps, or arguably, the single most important decision that really must be made in the context of the Republic of Uganda. And that is to choose a successor. Uganda regained its political independence on October the 9th, 1962. So it's about actually 58 years old today as we talk. But mind you, Paul, that Uganda has never, even for a single transition, experienced a smooth transition of power from one individual to another individual, or in fact, from one political party or from one junta or junta to another. You know, most people would like to see Uganda enjoy social, economic, political stability. But it doesn't seem to be happening on the ground as we talk.
Well, Shaka, I have news for you. Uganda prides itself as a country that has been stable for the last 35 years. Even a lot of pundits, a lot of observers say, even in a free, fair election, President Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa would still win an election today because he's hugely popular across the country. He might not be popular within the city centers, but when you go up country, he can still beat any challenger.
I have to say, Paul, that argument is bold dash. Because
how?
When you talk about proud of stability and what have you, how do you measure that kind of stability? Stability is not measured in the sense of the absence of war. Stability is not measured in the context of where people are silent. Stability is measured in the presence of social, economic, political, cultural justice for all. Does that obtain on the ground to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, but there are people who argue that one, you have to bring some semblance of order back to the country. You have people who are trigger happy. You have people who have no vested interest in the country, who are trying to destroy what has been built. People who are rioting, most of these are unemployed youth who are not invested in the country. And by that extension, I mean that somebody has to be in charge, has to bring some kind of order. That's why they unleashed security forces on some of these people.
Ndugu Paul, I believe that everyone has a right to own an opinion. But that does not mean that that same individual has a right to own his or her own sets of facts. The fact of the matter is, Uganda has been under the national resistance movement since 1986. Uganda, when you look at most of the reports which reflect the views of both domestic and foreign election observers, you will be very surprised what their conclusions are. Their conclusions generally do not talk about an election that was free, fair, transparent, verifiable, and credible. They talk about a situation where the ruling party enjoys a monopoly over everything you can think about, to the extent that they talk about how the results normally of those types of events called elections every 5 years reflect the will of the individuals who count the votes rather than the will of the people or the voters who cast their vote. Is that what you call stability?
Shaka, you bring up a very good point. I would like to agree with you, but at the same time, maybe push back and say that yes, you're correct in one way, but Museveni or President Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa has been subjecting himself to the people. People show up in droves to vote for him year in, year out.
You know, this is the same man, by the way. When he came into power, they spent time trying to rewrite the constitution, as if, in fact, they were reinventing the political wheel. All they needed to do was sit down, whether in parliament or in their political groups, and amend certain constitutional clauses without taking the country through the motions. But basically, they had to do that because they had to consolidate themselves into power. And so, my brother, what has happened is that you have had a situation when you look at a country like Tanzania, where President Yoweri Museveni went to school the last time I checked. That country, since Museveni came to power in 1986, has had 1, 2, 3, 4 presidents. You're talking about Ali Hassan Mwinyi, who took over from the founding president, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, in 1985. It was a very interesting, smooth political transition of power, by the way, Ndugu Paul, because I happened to be there. I was then a graduate student at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, and I was doing my research for my PhD dissertation. I was attached both to what they call Kio Kiku, the University of Dar es Salaam, and Tanzania Film Company, TFC. Nyerere was an incredible leader. He was a man who was going around addressing different political groups, different NGOs, and what have you, talking about thanking, in fact, them that they had given him an opportunity to be at the political helm of their country. Ali Hassan Mwinyi served his 2 terms. Then enter Benjamin Mkapa. Benjamin Mkapa also served his 2 terms. He has since passed away. May his soul rest in eternal peace. Enter Jakaya Mrisho Kikwete, the former foreign minister. He also served 2 terms. Then enter John Pombe Magufuli, who is, as we talk, serving his 2nd and last constitutional allowable term.
But Shaka, that's like comparing apples to oranges. There is no way you can compare Tanzania to Uganda. Hold on. And there is no way you can compare Tanzania to Uganda. On the surface, Tanzania looks like there is some kind of democracy. But internally, there is no democracy in Tanzania. The ruling party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, will do everything to stifle dissent, to stifle opposition. Even as we speak, look at what just happened in Tanzania. They only have 1 opposition leader in parliament. So how do you compare Tanzania to Uganda?
I did not claim that Tanzania is the beacon of hope for African democracy. As a matter of fact, Uganda itself is neither the beacon of hope, even for East African democracy. Even though Uganda was one of those few countries that was identified in the 1990s by the US President Bill Clinton administration as one of the few countries that was led by who the administration characterized as a new breed of African leaders who were the beacons of hope for African democracy. You know, they identified Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki. They identified Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia. They identified Yoweri Museveni in Uganda. To a certain degree, they also identified Rwanda. At the time, the leader, at least the nominal leader, was Pasteur Bizimungu. But the strongman who was pulling the political strings was Paul Kagame. Tell me whether there is any iota of democracy from Asimara through Addis Ababa to Kampala and Kigali. And if there is, what sort of democracy is that? How would you define it?
One could argue that all those leaders you've talked about, with the exception of Isaias Afwerki, at least they all subject themselves to periodic elections. They are voted, some overwhelmingly by 99% of the vote by their people.
You're right in the sense that those leaders, what makes them different from Isaias Afwerki is that at least they take their own people through the social political motions that something democratic is happening. But for a man like Isaias Afwerki has no reason to pretend what he does not believe in. You have to look at him and take him the way he is. I think that is the difference. So when you talk about democracy, democracy, at least according to Abraham Lincoln, is supposed to be defined as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But when you look at the aspect of democracy that is in Uganda, indeed is in a lot of other African countries, it is something that could be described as a government of some people, by some people, for some people. To put it in a broader perspective, the United States, since 1986, since Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa came to power, has had several presidents. It has had Donald J. Trump. It has had Barack Obama before him. And before Barack Obama, there was George W. Bush. And before George W. Bush, there was Bill Clinton. And before Bill Clinton, there was H.W. Bush. And before H.W. Bush, there was Ronald Reagan. That is the kind of, when you look at it, that is how you could probably compare and contrast the development of democracy in Uganda and in East Africa with the example of Tanzania and the United States, if we put it in a much broader perspective. I think we need a government in Uganda, along with the political parties, to create an environment, really, that will allow for a peaceful transfer of power from one group to another. Look at Kenya, for example. In Kenya, you did have the late Daniel Toroitich arap Moi, who ruled, some would say, with a very, very heavy hand for 24 years. But Daniel Toroitich arap Moi was smart enough at the end of the day to manage his political exit. And eventually, you had a grand coalition, a united front of political parties that ran against his choice of candidate, who was Uhuru Kenyatta. That was in 2002. And that grand coalition succeeded in winning an election that was organized by President Daniel Toroitich arap Moi. And that is when Emilio Mwai Kibaki became the third president of the Republic of Kenya. And therefore, you basically guaranteed social, political stability in Kenya. And so I think what should happen in Uganda really, you should have a united front made up of all political parties so that they can compete against the ruling party, even though the circumstances may not necessarily be favorable.
There are people that I've talked to, there are people that I've listened to from both sides who say that in a way, President Museveni has been a great guy, has been good for Uganda for the last 30 plus years. He has been a remarkable guy for Uganda. But at the same time, there are people who say maybe, yes, it's about change. There is this generational shift. Power needs to change from him to another person. And you see the kind of energy that Bobi Wine has brought to the mix. A lot of people say this is more of a generational change. Would you agree with that kind of assessment?
Oh, yes. It is true that Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa has made some positive contributions during his stay in power. But if he is not careful, he may actually overstay to the extent that people who will be looking at him later will probably see more of the negatives and probably emphasize more of the negative than the positive. When you look at Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa, when he came to power in the 1980s, Yoweri Museveni was a legitimate leader of his generation. And he had a message that was very appealing, very irresistible. And because of that, he was overwhelmingly supported by the vast majority of the Ugandan people. Now, when you talk about his competition, for example, with Bobi Wine, who represents the changing demographics, Bobi Wine may also arguably be a legitimate leader of his generation. And so when you compare the two, there is really no comparison, because Yoweri Museveni represents a generation whose future is behind it. And as for Bobi Wine, he represents a generation whose future is ahead of it.
Let's go to some comments. Sam Koikoya says, before condemning state actions, kindly recheck your actions. We are in the middle of COVID-19. So there are a lot of families that are hurting as a result of COVID-19. So please, when you are out there campaigning, try to at least be patriotic to those fans of yours and keep the social distancing going on.
I think Sam Koikoi has a point, except that in order for what he's looking for to happen, you have to have a situation where the political playing field must be leveled. And the way we are talking right now, the political playing field in Uganda is not leveled. What is needed is a spirit really of nationalism, short of Pan-Africanism.
Let's go to another comment here from Nyakana Jimmy. Unfortunately, the NRM claims NUP is full of hooligans, yet no one has come out of the government side to condemn the brutal killings of civilians on the streets. We've seen blood flowing on the streets of Kampala, and yet we are told these are security operatives, but somebody has to explain to Ugandans who are these people.
I think part of our problem, Nyakana, is that first and foremost, the average Ugandan is not socially and politically conscious of his or her rights. The average Ugandan is not politically aware of his or her powers. If the average Ugandan were aware of his or her powers, all these things we are talking about wouldn't happen. Because what is very simple is for the average Ugandan to be in a position to know or to identify the relationship between himself, herself, with this thing called the state, the government. Once you are able to identify that, then you establish the fact that in fact it is you who are the bosses and not the president who is your boss.
Let's go to James Wagoli. The country is dripping in injustice to the extent that no amount of bandages can stop the status quo. It's very unfortunate for the ongoing brutality unleashed upon the citizenry. The people of Uganda deserve better.
Yes, James. Well said. I couldn't agree with you more. But again, it comes down to the point I just made. It is about knowing the relationship between you and this thing called the government.
Akandwanaho Hannington, we are giving you a lot of freedom. You are misusing it. I saw a video of a policewoman being attacked by a supporter of Noop with a hammer. Your reaction?
You know, no political party, no political group is entitled to use violence as a means to getting to power. What we need is to begin respecting the importance of a conversation, of a dialogue. And for that to happen, the state or the ruling party must create a sort of political playing field that is leveled so that the members of the opposition can have unfettered access to the people so that they can sell their message.
Let's go to Nanyanzi. She says, we've seen a lot of criticism leveled against the government security forces, but I'm yet to see anybody from the Bobi Wine side condemn the kind of violence or the hooliganism we saw on the streets. People destroying people's property, people burning tires, destroying cars, and undressing women walking on the streets who happen to be wearing yellow t-shirts.
You know, I don't think that should be acceptable behavior, and I do not condone that type of behavior from anybody. The state itself has a right, in some cases, to use force. The state itself, through its agents, should not, for example, be at liberty to open fire with live ammunition against civilians. It should only do that if it is confronted with armed militias who are not allowed by the state to operate in that particular political environment.
Well, Shaka, thank you so much. I will leave it there.
You're most welcome.